Tracey Murray, principal at Griffith Hack, joins us to discuss the patent box. Tracey, there's been some bad press regarding the implementation of a patent box regime in a number of countries. Firstly, what is a patent box regime and why should Australia consider implementing it?
So patent box is, simply put, it's something that's a concessional tax treatment of the commercialisation of intellectual property, and really no one gave it any thought until probably 2013, I think it was, when the UK introduced the patent box system. And obviously they're a developed country that we've got an affinity with, so we do look closely at what tax they implement. It was introduced in April 2013 and immediately drew some fairly big players into the UK. As a result of that, a number of government and worldwide organisations started looking at it. The EU and the OECD really started to scrutinise their particular patent box regime and actually deemed it a harmful tax practice. And when you hear those words, that sounds something isn't right. There's something that's really drawing a tax benefit to the UK at the expense of someone else. What the OECD and the EU said is, because the UK's version, and there's many versions of patent box, but because the UK's version rewarded companies to just relocate to the UK without having done R&D in the UK, it really was stealing from your neighbours. So if I was in France and I wanted to get a concessional tax treatment for commercialising my IP, I was incentivised to go to the UK. The UK did take that on board and they changed their regime, their tax regime, to be best practice according to the OECD, which is really, if you want to be concessionally taxed on your commercialisation of intellectual property, then you have to. We will only allow companies that develop their R&D in the UK. So now it's all about protecting what's been developed in the UK rather than drawing intellectual property from other countries. And that's really what we're asking the Australian government to look at for Australia. Patent box for Australia should be all about trying to keep and protect what we develop in Australia for the benefit of Australia, rather than give countries an incentive to move to Ireland or Singapore or somewhere else where there's a much more concessionally taxing regime for the development of intellectual property and its commercialisation.
Tracey, that leads nicely into my next question. Who are the primary beneficiaries of the patent box regime?
There's a really easy answer and a really complicated economic answer, and I'll probably touch on both if that's all right. The main types of businesses in Australia that would benefit from patent box are manufacturers or companies who invest in research and development. Something's become successful and they want to commercialise it, and it requires investment. So for instance, IT, very transferable, so you can do that anywhere, not a big investment in capital. If I've invented the new 3D printer and I have to manufacture it and I have a heavy investment in manufacturing, sometimes countries will go, gosh, it's the cost of manufacture in Australia, if you take into account our cost of labour, foreign exchange issues that we've historically had, distance, transport, there's high tax regime, all of those conspire against a manufacturer to make the move offshore. And so in the short term, if you can concessionally tax the profits associated with exploiting that intellectual property, then that means those businesses get to keep money in their business because tax is cash out the door to another party, let's call it the tax office, and it gives them a bit of a level playing field when they look at exporting potentially overseas. Longer term question about who it benefits, I think Australia in general. It keeps companies in Australia. We're going to generate tax, and therefore there's more tax to tax compared to if they moved offshore. It's going to keep people employed. It's going to generate more demand for high intellect, high research, more university places, more money in the tax coffers of the tax office, so they can spend that on the community of Australia. So these regimes are introduced not just to keep IP into Australia, but IP is such a economically important attribute for any government that to reward businesses for keeping their IP and commercialising it in Australia has a very broad economic benefit for the rest of Australia. On the downside is if we don't look at it seriously, we're not even at a level playing field. We're behind the game because the UK's already introduced it. There is patent box type legislation in front of the US at the moment, and really once those two countries have a patent box regime and we're not even looking at it, you know, all our IP is going to go offshore.
Yeah, wow. It's certainly something we hope the government does consider. Tracey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.